In the last episode, we talked about how Europe was shaped after the Romans left Britain. We also touched a little on the origins of the Vikings, who started as pirates and started to vanquish England. So, let's hop into today's video as we go into more details about the Vikings Conquest, Part 2. After arriving in East Anglia, they forced the local King Edmund to provide them with horses and supplies before marching north to conquer York, the capital of Northumbria. At the time, this region was wrecked by a civil war between two rival claimants, one of whom, Aela, is later claimed to have been the king who killed Ragnar Lodbrok. Following this conflict, Northumbria would develop into a stronghold of Scandinavian culture for the following 2 centuries. Following its devastation of Northumbria, the army presumably went on to move once more, drawing more and more warriors to their banners as word of their conquest spread across the Scandinavian world. This time, they advanced into Mercia from the south, where they conquered Nottingham and engaged the army of the Mercian king Burgred. Wessex responded to Mercia's plea for assistance, but no actual combat took place because Ivar and his soldiers were confined to Nottingham's fortifications. The Mercian and West Saxon armies, which were largely composed of farmers, were eventually likely paid by Burgred to depart, and they dissolved to plough the fields. The Vikings moved back to York for the winter, much richer, content to accept clemency and coin for the time being. In keeping with their promise to Burgred, the sons of Lord Brock returned to East Anglia. In the new year, there they invaded the kingdom, making its King Edmund a martyr. East Anglia will experience the same fate as Northumbria and end up serving as a refugee for Danes for 2 centuries. The army separated in 870, with some soldiers remaining in their newly acquired domains in Northumbria and East Anglia, and others, like Ivar the Boneless, traveling to other parts of Britain to conquer new territories. In Ivar's case, this involved the Brittonic kingdom of Old Clud in southern Scotland. At this time, Halfdan assumes the lead since he led a portion of the army south, avoiding Mercia entirely in order to launch a raid into Wessex. After a 3-year break, during which his scouts and spies may have established their own presence in Essex, Halfdan and fellow warlord Baskech headed straight for Reading and fortified themselves in preparation for the anticipated West Saxon counterattack. Aethelwulf, the alderman of Berkshire, was waiting for Aethelred and Alfred when they arrived at Reading after gathering their levies. On January 4th, at Reading, they jointly attacked Halfdan's soldiers but were narrowly defeated. Over the following few days, the West Saxons came together once more and entered the battle. The war's biggest fight to date was fought on January 8 at a location named Ashdown on the Berkshire Downs. In the gloom and mist of a midwinter morning, Aethelred divided his army into 2 positions, placing himself in charge of one side and his younger brother Alfred in charge of the other. With the army's halves on either side of a ridgeway, they divided their army as the Danes drew near, with Baskech leading one and Halfdan the other. The Danes drew nearer, and Alfred and his group watched from behind their shield wall. Aethelred, on the other hand, seems to have made the decision that he must pray before the combat and refused to move forward until his prayer service was finished. Alfred decided to rush up the hill without the assistance of the second contingent, charging right into the center of the Danish lines, realizing that the Danish maneuver would cost him the benefit of the higher ground. The second force of Danes also maneuvered into the battle, which amounted to little more than a grueling hand-to-hand struggle of shield wall on shield wall. Apparently, unaware that Alfred's soldiers only made up half of the West Saxon army, Aethelred's force, whose approach may have been concealed and missed, finally engaged after intense fighting and considerable losses on both sides, surprising the Danes and favoring the West Saxons. Baskech was killed during battle, and Halfdan ordered his remaining soldiers to retreat, giving the West Saxons the upper hand. Anglo-Saxon forces eventually defeated the Great Heathen Army after 6 protracted years of defeat. Although the hard fighting may have made Halfdan more hesitant about his future intentions for Wessex, Ashdown was by no means a definitive triumph, and it was undoubtedly expensive. However, it was to Halfdan's good fortune that a group of fresh soldiers recently arrived from abroad slid up the Thames to join him and his remaining warriors who had retreated to the Reading. The next 7 protracted years of battle would be crucial for this enormous summer army, which was commanded by a sea monarch named Guthrum. In the ensuing months, Aethelred and Alfred, now referred to as the Boar of Ashdown, continued to battle the Danes, engaging them in a number of traditional fruitless battles. Most notably at Martin in March and Basing in late January. Aethelred, though, passed away in April. He may have died from combat injuries, and Alfred, the Boar of Ashdown, took his position as ruler. By this time, Halfdan had had enough of Wessex and agreed to depart, just as he and his brothers had done with Burgred back in Nottingham in 868, in exchange for a sizable sum of money from Alfred. Guthrum travelled east to seize control of the Vikings of East Anglia, while Halfdan headed north to become King of Northumbria. While Alfred had temporarily preserved his realm, he and all of his subjects were aware that the Vikings would soon return. The Great Heathen's army's invasion in Britain in 865 spread like wildfire. By 871, the political landscape of Britain had undergone complete redistribution following 6 protracted years of bloody conflict. The intruders had swept away the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of East Anglia and Northumbria, wiped off their governing families and seized their territory. Mercia was on the verge of total collapse in the Midlands, with roving Scandinavian bands flooding the eastern part of the country. Even though the Welsh kingdoms had to contend with their fair share of invasions, and the numerous rulers of Pictland in the north battled valiantly to maintain their own freedom, only one kingdom, Wessex, remains mostly unaltered. In the same way that Burgred of Mercia and Enmund of East Anglia had previously negotiated an agreement to pay a group of Viking invaders led by Halfdan to leave their kingdom earlier in the year, the country's new monarch, Alfred, knew that the sooner or later they would return. It wasn't an army in the traditional sense that the Great Heathen Army was. It was a confederation of military bands from all over the Scandinavian continent that had united to conquer Britain completely. When the chance arose, the army frequently dispersed into smaller groups. This tendency became even more pronounced when large tracts of territory started to be taken and subsequent victories were made. Halfdan left Wessex in 871 and travelled to Northumbria with roughly half of the army, 1,000 or so veterans he had fought alongside ever since his arrival in Britain. He started dividing the property between his soldiers when he got to the north and started to plough the fields. This was colonization rather than conquest now. While the Wessex campaign was going on, Ivar the Boneless, who wasn't present, was busy conquering yet another old country, this time with his ally Olaf the White, a Norse sea king of Dublin, who was active in the Irish Sea. Together, they besieged the Brythonic kingdom of Alt, Clud's capital, Dumbarton Rock, for 4 months before the defenders ultimately capitulated in the year 870. No quarter would be granted. The citadel was leveled, its guardians were killed, and the survivors were transported to be sold as slaves in York and Dublin. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Stay tuned for the next part where we talk about the Vikings conquering of England in more detail. But until then, stay safe and make sure to subscribe to our channel so you do not miss out on part 3 of how the Vikings exactly conquered Britain.